Here's part 2 of Ghost of Tsushima on the proposed minimum requirement. If you remember, the first one was with the GTX 960, and the other card that they proposed was the RX5500 XT, which in my opinion doesn't make sense because the card is over 50% more performing than the GTX 960. So welcome back to Response PC. I'm Dunk. Let's game on. Now, if you remember from the first video of Ghost of Tsushima proposed minimum requirement, the GTX 960, the 4GB variant, not the 2GB, we were reaching an average of 44 FPS at the lowest setting at 1080p. Now, you'll see in a couple seconds why I did a separate video to do the RX5500 XT. First off, the GTX 960 was released Q1 of 2015, so just finished 2014, and the RX5500 XT was released 2019 Q4, so almost 2020. So it's almost 6 years difference in age between those two cards. Yes, my RX5500 XT is the 8GB variant. I guess they were meant to do the 4GB variant compared to the GTX 960 4GB, but even the RX5500 XT 4GB variant is comparable to the GTX 1650 Super, not the GTX 960 4GB. So now, let's start the testing. The RX5500 XT 8GB variant at 1080p at the lowest settings, still with my i3-6100 and 8GB of memory. The gameplay gave me an average of 85 FPS. 85, not the 44 or 45, 85. Even the lowest FPS, I go down to 55 FPS, but depending on the area, some area I will reach in the mid 90s, 95, 96 FPS. Just to show you that the RX5500 XT is not the card to compare with the GTX 960 4GB. It would be even worse, it was the 2GB. It was really playable with the GTX 960, it's highly playable with the RX5500 XT. And even though I'm using the 8GB variant, the VRAM usage is at the 3 to 3.4, 3.5GB of VRAM. So the 4GB or the 8GB RX5500 XT won't do a difference in that particular case. And since we have that card in the system, let's try other settings. Let's push that card to higher limits. Let's completely skip low settings. So from lowest to directly to medium settings, because not only the VRAM was in the 3.5GB out of 8, the GPU utilization was in the mid 80 to low 80s. So this card can probably take 1440p at the lowest settings, maybe even at medium, because pushing the setting at medium at 1080p, the VRAM climbed to 4.3GB of VRAM utilization, and the GPU utilization is in the mid 90. We're close to 100%, but it is still again highly playable. And since we still have a headroom for the GPU utilization and the VRAM, I push to high settings. And that seems to be the perfect climax for that card, as we are averaging 61 FPS, a nice sweet spot of 60 FPS. The GPU utilization is in the mid 90s to peg at 100%, and the VRAM is at 5.8 to 6.2GB of VRAM. This is the perfect spot for that card, so high settings, 1080p. In combat I drop at 55, 57 FPS, and inside the building, like a small house, it reaches 74, 75 FPS. So it's probably going to drop in the maybe high 40 when you reach a big city or big village, which I'm not there yet. So here you have it. The proposed minimum requirement RX5500 XT is busted. I mean that the game will be playable, but it's not the real minimum requirement to play this game, and nothing to be compared to the GTX 960. And that's all for today's Ghost of Tsushima proposed minimum requirement part 2. See you on the next one, and don't forget to subscribe.